episode 110. Harry bent closer, his head right inside the cabinet. The silvery substance had become transparent. It looked like glass. He looked down into it, expecting to see the stone bottom of the basin, and saw instead an enormous room below the surface of the mysterious substance. A room into which he seemed to be looking through a circular window in the ceiling. The room was dimly lit. He thought it might even be underground, for there were no windows, merely torches in brackets such as the ones that illuminated the walls of Hogwarts. Lowering his face so that his nose was a mere inch away from the glassy substance, Harry saw that rows and rows of witches and wizards were sat around every wall on what seemed to be benches rising in levels. An empty chair stood in the very center of the room. There was something about the chair that gave Harry an ominous feeling. Chains encircled the arms of it as though its occupants were usually tied to it. Where was this place? It surely wasn't Hogwarts. He had never seen a room like that here in the castle. Moreover, the crowd in the mysterious room at the bottom of the basin was composed of adults, and Harry knew there were not nearly that many teachers at Hogwarts. They seemed, he thought, to be waiting for something. Even though he could only see the tops of their pointed hats, they all seemed to be facing in one direction, and nobody was talking to anybody else. The basin being circular and the room he was observing square, Harry could not make out what was going on in the corners of it. He leaned even closer, tilting his head and trying to see. The tip of his nose touched the strange substance into which he was staring. Dumbledore's office gave an almighty lurch. Harry was thrown forwards and pitched headfirst into the substance inside the basin. But his head did not hit the stone bottom. He was falling through something icy cold and black. It was like being sucked into a dark whirlpool. And suddenly, he found himself sitting on a bench at the end of the room inside the basin, a bench raised high above the others. He looked up at the high stone ceiling, expecting to see the circular window through which he had just been staring, but there was nothing there but dark, solid stone. Breathing hard and fast, Harry looked around him. Not one of the witches and wizards in the room, and there were at least 200 of them, was looking at him. Not one of them seemed to have noticed that a 14-year-old boy had just dropped from the ceiling into their midst. Harry turned to the wizard next to him on the bench and uttered a loud cry of surprise that reverberated around the silent room. He was sitting right next to Albus Dumbledore. "Professor!" Harry said in a kind of strangled whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just looking at that basin in your cabinet. Where are we?" But Dumbledore didn't move or speak. He ignored Harry completely. Like every other wizard on the benches, he was staring into the far corner of the room where there was a door. Harry gazed nonplussed at Dumbledore, then around at the silently watchful crowd, then back at Dumbledore, and then it dawned on him. Once before, Harry had found himself in a place where no one could see or hear him. That time, he had fallen through a page in an enchanted diary, right into somebody else's memory. And unless he was very much mistaken, something of the sort had happened again. Harry raised his right hand, hesitated, and then waved it energetically in front of Dumbledore's face. Dumbledore did not blink, look around at Harry, or indeed move at all, and that, in Harry's opinion, settled the matter. Dumbledore wouldn't ignore him like that. He was inside a memory, And this was not the present-day Dumbledore. Yet it couldn't be that long ago. The Dumbledore sitting next to him now was silver-haired, just like the present-day Dumbledore. But what was this place? What were all these wizards waiting for? Harry looked around more carefully. The room, as he had suspected when observing it from above, was almost certainly underground. More of a dungeon than a room, he thought. There was a bleak and forbidding air about the place. There were no pictures on the walls, no decorations at all, just these serried rows of benches rising in levels all around the room, all positioned so that they had a clear view of that chair with the chains on its arms. Before Harry could reach any conclusions about the place in which they were, he heard footsteps. The door in the corner of the dungeon opened and 3 people entered. Well, or at least one man, flanked by 2 Dementors. Harry's insides went cold. The Dementors, tall, hooded creatures whose faces were concealed, were gliding slowly toward the chair in the center of the room, each grasping one of the man's arms with their dead and rotten-looking hands. The man between them looked as though he was about to faint, and Harry couldn't blame him. He knew the Dementors could not touch him inside a memory, but Harry remembered their power only too well. The watching crowd recoiled slightly as the Dementors placed the man in the chain chair and glided back out of the room. The door swung shut behind them. Harry looked down at the man now sitting in the chair and saw it was Karkaroff. Unlike Dumbledore, Karkaroff looked much younger. His hair and goatee were black. He was not dressed in sleek furs, but in thin and ragged robes. He was shaking. Even as Harry watched, the chains on the arms of the chair glowed suddenly gold and snaked their way up his arms, binding him there. "Igor Karkaroff," said a curt voice to Harry's left. Harry looked around and saw Mr. Crouch standing in the middle of the bench beside him. Crouch's hair was dark. His face was much less lined. He looked fit and alert. "You have been brought from Azkaban to give evidence to the Ministry of Magic. You have given us to understand that you have important information for us." Karkaroff straightened himself as best he could, tightly bound to the chair. "I have, sir," he said, and although his voice was very scared, Harry could still hear the familiar, unctuous note in it. "I wish to be of use to the Ministry. I wish to help. I know that the Ministry is trying to round up the last of the Dark Lord's supporters. I am eager to assist in any way I can." There was a murmur around the benches. Some of the wizards and witches were surveying Karkaroff with interest, others with pronounced mistrust. Then Harry heard, quite distinctly from Dumbledore's other side, a familiar, growling voice say, "Filth." Harry leaned forward so he could see past Dumbledore. Mad-Eye Moody was sitting there, though there was a very noticeable difference in his appearance. He did not have his magical eye, but 2 normal ones. Both were looking down upon Karkaroff, and both were narrowed in intense dislike. "Crouch is going to let him out," Moody breathed quietly to Dumbledore. "He's done a deal with him. Took me 6 months to track him down, and Crouch is going to let him go if he's got enough new names. Well, let's hear his information, I say, and throw him straight back to the Dementors." Dumbledore made a small noise of dissent through his long, crooked nose. "I was forgetting. You don't like the Dementors, do you, Albus?" said Moody with a sardonic smile. "No," said Dumbledore calmly. "I'm afraid I don't. I have long felt the Ministry is wrong to ally itself with such creatures." "But for filth like this," Moody said softly.